We didn't adopt you out of love. We adopted you because the government paid us to." Those were the exact words my adoptive mother, Margaret Hale, said to me in front of more than 40 people. It was a Saturday night in October, right in the middle of my 28th birthday dinner at the Copper Lantern restaurant in our small town of Silver Creek, Colorado. Margaret had just stood up, smiled a cold smile, and dropped that line loudly enough for the whole room to hear. The entire table went completely silent. You could hear a pin drop. Friends, local business owners, and people I had known my entire life stopped eating and stared at me with wide eyes. They expected me to break down, yell, or storm out of the restaurant in tears. They expected me to be completely destroyed by the woman who raised me. But Margaret didn't know one crucial thing. I wasn't shocked at all because I had been waiting for this exact moment for 11 long months. And those 4 people sitting quietly at a corner table in the back of the restaurant, they weren't strangers who just happened to be eating dinner. They were my real family, and they were here for a reason. But to understand how I got to this explosive dinner, I have to take you back to 11 months ago. It was a freezing afternoon, and I was helping clean out the old storage shed behind the Hale family lumberyard. Margaret and her husband, the man I spent my life calling Dad, owned a lumberyard, and they always treated me more like an unpaid employee than a son. They had told me to clear out decades of junk from the back shed. It was dirty, backbreaking work, but I was used to it. I had been working in that yard since I was a kid. While I was moving a massive pile of rotted wood and rusty tools, I noticed something shoved deep into the corner, buried under an old tarp. It was an old metal safe. It looked like it had been forgotten there for years. The combination lock was covered in a thick layer of dust. I don't know why, but my gut told me to try opening it. I tried their wedding anniversary, the lumberyard's grand opening date, and finally, Margaret's own birthday. The lock clicked heavily. The steel door swung open. Inside, there was no money or jewelry, just a thick, yellowed manila envelope filled with old documents. I pulled it out, wiped off the dirt, and opened it. The first thing I pulled out was an original birth certificate. It didn't have the name Ethan Hale on it. It had a different last name entirely, but the date of birth and the hospital were mine. Underneath, there was a thick stack of official adoption records. I had always known I was adopted, of course. Margaret made sure to remind me whenever she felt I wasn't being grateful enough for the roof over my head. But I had never seen my actual, original paperwork. Then I found the bills. They were invoices from a lawyer detailing the adoption process and legal fees. And right there on the second page of a state document was a single line of text. Someone, probably Margaret, had highlighted it in bright yellow marker. State adoption subsidy, $11,200 per year. I stared at those words until my vision blurred. I sat down on a dusty wooden crate in the freezing shed, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I did the math in my head. They received $11,200 every single year until I turned 18. That was over $200,000 in total. Everything clicked. Everything made terrifying, disgusting sense. I realized right then in that cold shed that my adoptive family hadn't taken me in out of kindness or love. I was never a son to them. I was a business transaction. I was a steady stream of government income. The lack of affection, the constant demands to work at the lumberyard for free, the way they never hugged me or told me they were proud of me, it all traced back to that highlighted line. I wasn't a child to them. I was a paycheck. Sitting there in the dark, I felt my entire identity shatter into pieces. I started doubting every single memory I had ever made in that house. Every birthday, every Christmas, every family dinner. It was all built on a massive lie. They didn't want me. They just wanted the money the state sent them to keep me. Most people would have grabbed those papers, marched straight into the lumberyard office, slammed them on Margaret's desk, and screamed until their throat bled. I wanted to do exactly that, but I didn't. I knew Margaret. She was manipulative, smart, and deeply obsessed with her reputation in Silver Creek. If I confronted her without a solid plan, she would twist the truth, play the victim, and make me look like a crazy, ungrateful kid making up stories. I decided right then and there, I was not going to confront them immediately. I was going to destroy them. And to do that, I needed to prepare quietly. My first step was gathering evidence. I carefully put the documents back exactly how I found them, but not before taking out my phone and sneaking photos of everything. I secretly copied the entire contents of the safe, snapping clear, high-resolution pictures of every single page. I made sure the lawyer's name, the state subsidy amount, and the original birth certificate details were perfectly readable. Then I locked the safe, covered it back up with the tarp, and walked out of the shed like absolutely nothing had happened. That night at dinner, I sat across from Margaret and her husband. I ate my food, smiled, and asked them about their day at work. My stomach was churning the whole time, but I played the part perfectly. I had to. The next morning, I took action. I went online and ordered a commercial DNA testing kit. I paid for expedited shipping. I needed to know who I really was, where I actually came from, and if there was anyone out there who might have actually wanted me. I knew the adoption records I found in the safe were shady. The lawyer's invoices showed massive fees that looked highly suspicious. That meant my real history was buried, and the state official channels were probably useless. Blood was the only thing they couldn't forge. When the DNA kit arrived a few days later, I sneaked out to my truck, spit into the plastic tube, sealed it up, and dropped it in a mail collection box on the other side of town. Then, the waiting began. While I waited for the DNA results, I didn't just sit around. I took the photos of the documents from the safe and started digging deeper. I hired a private genealogist online, paying them with a separate, secret bank account I opened just for this investigation. I sent them the photos of my original birth certificate and the lawyer's name. I told them to trace the lawyer's past cases and find whatever old hospital records they could dig up from the year I was born. I explained that I suspected the adoption was processed unethically, maybe even illegally. The genealogist warned me that digging into sealed records was incredibly difficult and expensive, but I didn't care. I emptied my savings. I needed the truth. I needed to know how a child becomes an $11,200 annual paycheck for a family that didn't even want him. Every single day working at the lumber yard became an exhausting test of endurance. I would load heavy delivery trucks, cut wood in the freezing cold, and take orders from Margaret, all while knowing she looked at me and saw nothing but a series of cashed government checks. Sometimes she would complain about how much I cost them to feed and clothe when I was a teenager. It took everything in me not to laugh in her face. The anger didn't make me sloppy, though. It made me hyper-focused. I was building a rock-solid case against them. I was putting together a bomb, and I was going to detonate it in front of everyone she cared about. I just had to wait for the pieces to fall into place. And a few weeks later, when my phone buzzed with an email notification saying your DNA results are ready, the first piece finally did. The email notification from the DNA testing company arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was loading a flatbed truck with heavy pine boards. I remember the cold wind stinging my face as I pulled my phone out of my heavy work jacket. The subject line simply said my results were ready. I didn't open it right away. I couldn't. Margaret was standing just 20 feet away, holding a clipboard, complaining loudly to a driver about a late delivery. I stared at her for a second, watching this woman who had built a comfortable upper-middle-class life off my existence. And then I walked straight into the employee bathroom and locked the door. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type in my passcode. I logged into the portal and clicked on the DNA Relatives tab. The screen loaded, and right there at the very top of the list, with a genetic match of over 50%, was a name. It didn't say distant cousin or third cousin. The relationship tag clearly and undeniably read, Father. The name on the screen was Lucas Navarro. I clicked on his profile, feeling like the concrete floor was dropping out from under my work boots. He had filled out a brief biography on the site. He was 52 years old and listed his previous occupation as a firefighter. My eyes frantically scanned down the page to his location. He lived in a town called Mesa Ridge, New Mexico. I quickly pulled up a map application on my phone and typed in the town's name. It was only a 4-hour drive from Silver Creek. 4 hours. For 28 years, my real father had been living just a half-day's drive away from the lumber yard where I was currently hiding in a dirty bathroom. There was a button on his profile to send a direct message. I stood there staring at it for what felt like an hour. What do you even say to a man who might not want you? What if he was the one who gave me away to Margaret and her husband for the state money? I pushed those agonizing doubts aside. I had to know the absolute truth. I tapped the button and typed out a short, direct message. I introduced myself, gave him my exact birth date, and mentioned the specific hospital in Colorado where I was born. I hit send, shoved the phone back into my pocket, and went back out into the freezing lumber yard to finish loading the truck. I expected to wait weeks for a reply. I figured a 52-year-old ex-firefighter might not check a commercial DNA website every single day. I was completely wrong. Less than 3 hours later, while I was taking my short lunch break in the cab of my truck, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the DNA site. I had a new message from Lucas Navarro. I opened it immediately, my heart hammering against my ribs. He didn't write a long, complicated paragraph. He didn't ask for more proof or ask me to verify my identity. His reply consisted of exactly one sentence. It simply read, "I never stopped looking for you." Those 7 words hit me harder than a physical punch. I broke down. I sat alone in the cab of my truck and cried until my chest physically ached. Margaret had always told me that my birth parents were irresponsible, selfish teenagers who didn't care about me and dumped me at the hospital the second I was born. She used that brutal story to make me feel constantly grateful for the sacrifices she made to raise me. But Lucas's message destroyed that lie instantly. He had been looking for me. I was wanted. Later that same week, I finally got the comprehensive investigation report back from the private genealogist I had hired online. I sat at my small kitchen table in my rented apartment. Margaret made sure I paid her rent on time every single month, of course, and read through the massive PDF file. The genealogist had managed to uncover the dark, twisted paper trail left behind by Margaret's adoption lawyer. The reality of my past was horrifying. My birth mother had never abandoned me. Her name was Elena, and according to the old hospital logs and sealed social services notes the genealogist somehow dug up, she had desperately wanted to keep me. But my birth parents were young, poor, and incredibly vulnerable at the time. The documents showed that they were aggressively targeted and ultimately forced to sign away their parental rights. Margaret's lawyer had systematically manipulated the situation, threatening them with massive legal debts and falsely claiming the state would take me away and place me in a highly abusive foster home if they didn't surrender custody to his clients immediately. Once my parents were terrified enough to sign the papers, that same lawyer deliberately altered the official adoption records. He changed key details to make it look like a standard, voluntary abandonment, so the state would approve the adoption subsidy without asking any difficult questions. Margaret and her husband knew exactly what they were doing. They hired a ruthless attorney to legally steal a child from a terrified young couple just to secure a monthly government check. But the sickening discoveries didn't stop there. The genealogist had found something else, something that made my blood run completely cold. While digging into the lawyer's past court cases, they stumbled upon Margaret and her husband's full foster and adoption history in the state of Colorado. I wasn't their first attempt at this sick scheme. Margaret and her husband had actually adopted 3 other children before me. I stared at the glowing computer screen, completely horrified. 3 other kids had lived in that house before I arrived. I aggressively searched through the rest of the report to find out what happened to them. The details were tragically brief, but they painted a crystal-clear picture of Margaret's business model. One of the children had been sent right back into the foster care system after just a short time. Margaret probably realized that child was too difficult to manage, making the state subsidy unprofitable. Another child was eventually transferred to an entirely different family. And the 3rd child? The records just stopped dead. They had completely lost contact with the system and vanished off the state's radar entirely. I sat back in my chair, feeling a deep, physical nausea wash over me. It was a business, a literal business. Margaret and her husband were bringing in kids, testing them out like leased factory equipment, and returning them if they didn't offer a solid return on their financial investment. I finally understood the terrifying reality of my entire existence. I wasn't special. I wasn't chosen because they saw something in me. I was just the final, successful product. I was simply the one kid who was quiet enough, compliant enough, and useful enough to be kept around as a long-term income stream. I couldn't stop thinking about those 3 other children. Did they sleep in my bedroom before I got there? Did they work in a lumber yard? sweeping up sawdust for free, just like I did. The thought that I was just the most profitable unit in Margaret's twisted little enterprise made me want to march down to the lumber yard and burn it to the ground. Every time I looked at Margaret sitting in her comfortable, air-conditioned office, sipping expensive coffee, I saw the faces of those nameless kids. I saw my birth parents being bullied by a predatory lawyer. I saw that yellow highlighted line, $11,200 per year. I was a walking, breathing paycheck, and she had the absolute nerve to treat me like a burden. I had to get out of Silver Creek, even if just for a day. I needed to see the man who sent me that message. I needed to look Lucas Navarro in the eye. Over the next few days, Lucas and I exchanged a flurry of emails. We didn't want to wait any longer to meet. I told Margaret I was going on a camping trip alone, packed a small bag, and got into my truck early Saturday morning. As I drove out of Silver Creek and hit the highway heading south toward New Mexico, my heart was pounding. I was leaving behind a life built entirely on a foundation of greed, and I was driving 4 hours to finally meet the family that had been robbed of 28 years with their son. The drive took exactly 4 hours, just like the map app had predicted. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white the entire time. When I finally crossed the city limits in a Mesa Ridge, my GPS guided me through a quiet, working-class neighborhood filled with small, well-kept homes. I pulled up to a house with a faded red truck in the driveway and parked across the street. I just sat there in the driver's seat for 10 minutes, watching the front door, trying to remember how to breathe. I was about to secretly meet Lucas Navarro, my biological father, for the very first time. I finally gathered enough courage to turn off the engine, get out of my truck, walk up the concrete path, and knock on the front door. It opened almost immediately. Standing there was a man who looked exactly like an older version of me. We had the same eyes, the same jawline, and the same messy dark hair. It was Lucas. He didn't say hello. He didn't offer a polite handshake. He just let out a choked, heavy sob and pulled me into a massive, crushing hug. I had never been hugged like that in my entire life, not once by Margaret or her husband. He led me inside the house, and that was when I met the rest of my biological family. Standing in the living room, frantically wiping away tears, was Elena Navarro, my real mother. Next to her was a tall, athletic kid who looked like he could be my twin, who I quickly learned was my 22-year-old brother, Mateo. And peeking out from behind his shoulder with a huge, nervous smile was my 19-year-old sister, Isabella. I had a brother and a sister. I had a real family. For 28 years, I thought I was an unwanted only child living in a cold, silent house, but I actually had siblings who shared my blood and my features. We sat down in their cozy living room, and the next few hours completely broke my heart and pieced it back together at the exact same time. They didn't just tell me they loved me and missed me. They proved it. Elena went to a wooden cabinet in the hallway and brought out a small, worn-out shoebox. Her hand was shaking as she opened it and placed the contents carefully on the coffee table. Inside, she had kept an ultrasound picture of me from before I was even born. Right next to it was the tiny, faded plastic hospital bracelet from the day I was delivered. But the thing that completely broke my composure was a thick stack of envelopes tied together with a piece of string. Elena carefully untied them and handed one to me. She told me she had written a letter to me every single year on my birthday. She never knew where I was, and she never knew if I was safe, but she sat down and wrote to me anyway. She told me about Mateo losing his first tooth, about Isabella learning how to ride a bike, and about how much they missed their oldest son. I read the first letter, and tears started streaming down my face. I couldn't stop them. Then Elena reached out, grabbed my hand tightly, looked me dead in the eyes, and said something I will never, ever forget. She looked at me and said, "Every birthday, I set an empty plate at dinner." I sat in that living room and cried with people who felt like home. They explained everything from their side, confirming exactly what the private genealogist had found. They were young, terrified, and broke when they had me. Margaret's lawyer had threatened them with police action, told them they would go to jail for child neglect if they didn't surrender me, and completely bullied them into signing those papers. They spent the next 2 decades trying to find me, but because the lawyer had illegally altered the records, I was practically a ghost in the system. Leaving their house that evening was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. Mateo gave me a tight hug. Isabella made me promise to text her the second I got home, and my parents stood on the porch watching my truck until I turned the corner. I drove back to Silver Creek feeling like a completely different person. I was no longer a discarded, unwanted burden. I was Ethan Navarro. I was loved. But as soon as I pulled back into the driveway of Margaret's house, reality hit me like a ton of bricks. I still had to play the game. I still had to pretend I was her obedient, grateful, adopted son. I still had to go to work at the lumber yard on Monday morning and load heavy wood onto trucks for free. Over the next few months, something shifted in the house. It was like Margaret could sense a change in my attitude, or maybe her own hidden timeline was just speeding up. I was getting closer and closer to my 28th birthday, and her behavior went from coldly indifferent to aggressively hostile. It started with small, petty things. She would criticize the way I dressed, complain about the electricity I used, and demand I work even longer hours at the yard on weekends. But then it escalated dramatically. One evening, I came home from a grueling 10-hour shift, completely covered in dirt and sawdust. Margaret was waiting for me at the kitchen table. She slid a typed piece of paper toward me without even looking up from her phone. It was a formal notice. Suddenly, the rent on my room was tripled. I stared at the paper in disbelief. I was already paying her market rate for a tiny bedroom in a house I helped maintain. Tripling it meant I would be handing over almost my entire paycheck right back to her. When I asked her why she was doing this, she simply rolled her eyes and ignored me. A few days later, she dropped another bomb. I went to the local pharmacy to pick up some basic allergy medication, only to be told by the pharmacist that my insurance card was declined. I called Margaret from the parking lot. She calmly informed me that she had cut me off the family insurance. She didn't give me a warning so I could find my own policy. She just canceled it and let me find out at the cash register. I drove back to the house, my blood boiling. I walked straight into the living room where she was watching television and demanded to know what was going on. Why was she suddenly trying to bleed me dry and strip away my basic safety nets? Margaret didn't even mute the TV. She just turned her head, gave me that familiar, condescending look she had perfected over 28 years, and threatened me with a completely straight face. She looked at me and said, "You're 28. You're no longer our responsibility." I stood there in the living room, staring at the woman who had traded my childhood for a series of government checks. She wasn't just being mean. This was a calculated business move. I finally understood that she was preparing to get rid of me. The state subsidies had stopped when I turned 18, of course. For the last 10 years, I had only been useful to her as cheap, reliable labor at the lumber yard and a source of monthly rent money. But now I was turning 28. I was getting older, maybe starting to ask too many questions, maybe becoming too independent. The cost-to-benefit ratio of keeping me around was no longer working in her favor. I wasn't a profitable asset anymore. I was becoming a financial liability to her. And just like those 3 other kids she had cycled through the system before me, she was getting ready to toss me out. She wanted me to quit. She wanted me to pack my bags, move out because I couldn't afford the new tripled rent, and disappear from her life quietly. She wanted to wash her hands of me without taking any of the blame, telling everyone in town that I was an ungrateful son who just abandoned them. That was the exact moment the final piece of my plan snapped into place. If she wanted me gone, I was going to leave. But there was absolutely no way in hell I was going to leave quietly. I was going to make sure every single person in Silver Creek knew exactly who Margaret Hale really was. The moment Margaret told me I was no longer their responsibility, something inside me completely snapped, but it didn't break me. Instead, it gave me a terrifying sense of clarity. I realized she was trying to force me out of the house because I had outlived my financial usefulness. She wanted me to just quietly disappear so she could keep her pristine reputation in Silver Creek intact. I decided right then and there that I was not going to leave in silence. She had stolen 28 years of my life, robbed another family of their son, and treated me like a disposable piece of machinery, all while pretending to be a saint. I wanted the absolute truth to be told, and I wanted it exposed in front of absolutely everyone. I knew that a private argument in our living room wouldn't accomplish anything. Margaret was a master manipulator. If I confronted her privately, she would just deny it, call me crazy, and spin a story to the whole town about how her adopted son had lost his mind and attacked her. I needed a public stage. I needed witnesses. I began meticulously planning everything around the evening of my upcoming 28th birthday. Margaret, in a bizarre and highly calculated move, formally invited me out to dinner at the Copper Lantern to celebrate my birthday. The Copper Lantern was the nicest, most popular restaurant in Silver Creek. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and local business owners loved to go there to see and be seen. Margaret inviting me, there wasn't an act of maternal love. It was a PR stunt. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was going to throw a large, highly visible dinner, pay the bill, and play the role of the generous, loving mother one last time. That way, when I suddenly moved out a week later because I couldn't afford or tripled rent, she could play the victim and tell the town how ungrateful I was after everything she had done for me. It was the perfect setup, but she was digging her own grave. She thought she was directing the show, but she didn't know I had completely rewritten the script. My first call was to Lucas. I didn't want to just tell him what I was doing. I needed him there. I secretly invited my real family, Lucas, Elena, Mateo, and Isabella, to make the drive up to Silver Creek for that specific night. I told Lucas about the restaurant, the setup, and what I planned to do. He didn't even hesitate. He told me they would be there, sitting quietly in the background, ready to support me. But having my real family, there wasn't enough to take down someone like Margaret. I needed undeniable, legal firepower. Using the rest of my secret savings, I hired a tough, no-nonsense attorney from a neighboring city who specialized in adoption fraud and civil litigation. I handed him the photos from the safe, the DNA results, and the thick report from the private genealogist. When he read through the documents and saw how Margaret's previous lawyer had illegally altered state records to secure the $11,200 annual subsidy, his jaw practically dropped. He told me we had a massive case. I told him I didn't just want to sue them later. I wanted to confront them now. I made sure my lawyer was also present at the restaurant that night. I paid him his hourly rate to simply sit at a table, eat a steak, and wait for my signal. I still needed one more piece to make the trap inescapable. Margaret cared about her public image more than she cared about human beings. So, I decided to destroy that image permanently. I reached out to a contact I had made years ago, a hungry local journalist who worked for the county newspaper. I gave him a very brief, anonymous tip about a massive, decades-long fraud scheme involving one of Silver Creek's most prominent business owners and hundreds of thousands of dollars in misappropriated state funds. I didn't give him Margaret's name over the phone, but I told him exactly where and when the story was going to break. He took the bait. A local journalist was also sitting quietly in the restaurant that night, completely undercover. For the next 2 weeks, I lived a double life. During the day, I worked at the lumber yard, lifting heavy wood, taking orders from Margaret, and pretending to be stressed about how I was going to afford my new rent. I smiled, I nodded, and I played the submissive, defeated kid she thought I was. At night, I was coordinating with Lucas, briefing my lawyer, and perfectly timing the events of the upcoming dinner. Margaret had absolutely no idea what was actually waiting for her. She spent the week leading up to the dinner boasting to her friends and the other lumber yard employees about the big birthday party she was throwing for me. She invited dozens of people, local politicians, our neighbors, people from our church, and other business owners in Silver Creek. She wanted a massive audience to witness her fake generosity. She wanted everyone to see what a good person she was. I wanted exactly the same thing. I wanted them all to have front row seats. Finally, the Saturday night of my 28th birthday arrived. I put on a clean button-down shirt, drove myself to the Copper Lantern, and walked through the heavy wooden front doors. The restaurant was packed. Margaret had reserved the entire center section of the dining room. There were over 40 people mingling, drinking wine, and laughing. When I walked in, Margaret rushed over, grabbed my arm, and loudly announced to the room that the birthday boy had arrived. People clapped. They patted me on the back. It made my skin crawl, but I forced a smile and took my seat near the head of the long table. As the waitstaff started bringing out appetizers and pouring drinks, I let my eyes casually scan the perimeter of the room. I had to make sure everything was in place. Over by the large front window, sitting alone with a notepad and a small digital recorder resting on the table, was the local journalist. He was casually sipping a beer, blending in perfectly. 2 tables away from him, sitting in a dark leather booth and looking completely professional in a sharp suit, was my lawyer. We made brief eye contact, and he gave me a barely noticeable nod. He had his briefcase resting on the seat next to him, filled with every single piece of incriminating evidence we had gathered. And finally, my eyes moved to a quiet, dimly lit corner table in the very back of the restaurant. My heart skipped a beat. Sitting there, looking incredibly nervous but fiercely determined, were Lucas, Elena, Mateo, and Isabella. My real mother caught my eye and offered a small, brave smile. My father sat completely still, his eyes locked on a Margaret with an intensity that genuinely scared me. They were here. My real family had driven 4 hours just to have my back. Everything was perfectly set. The explosive charges were placed, the audience was seated, and the woman who had ruined my life was completely oblivious, laughing and drinking wine at the center of the room. I sat back in my chair, picked up my water glass, and waited for Margaret to make her move. I knew she couldn't resist making a speech. I just had to wait for her to stand up and hand me the match. The dinner was going exactly how Margaret had planned. For the first hour, she played the perfect host. She walked around the long table, refilling wine glasses, laughing loudly at terrible jokes, and making sure every single person in our section of the Copper Lantern saw what an incredibly generous mother she was. The 40 guests, local business owners, our neighbors, and people I had grown up around, were completely charmed by her performance. They ate the expensive steaks she was paying for and praised her for throwing such a wonderful 28th birthday party for her adopted son. I just sat there, eating my food and watching the clock. I knew she couldn't let the night end without making it all about herself. She needed the validation. She needed the crowd to look at her and see a saint. Around 8 o'clock, just as the waiters were clearing the dinner plates to make room for dessert, Margaret finally made her move. She stood up at the head of the table, picked up her half-empty wine glass, and tapped it loudly with a silver spoon. The sharp clinking sound cut through the noise of the restaurant. Slowly, the conversations at our table died down. People turned in their chairs to look at her. Even the tables nearby, the ones not part of our party, quieted down to listen. Margaret smiled that perfectly rehearsed, warm smile she always used in public. "Thank you all so much for coming tonight," she began, her voice loud enough to carry across the dining room. "It means the world to my husband and me to have our closest friends here to celebrate Ethan's 28th birthday." People clapped politely. I just kept my eyes locked on her. 28 years is a long time," she continued, her tone suddenly shifting, becoming slightly more dramatic. She let out a heavy, theatrical sigh. "When we took Ethan and all those years ago, we knew it wasn't going to be easy. Raising a child is incredibly difficult. Raising a child that isn't your own blood, a child from a complicated background, well, it requires a lot of sacrifice, a lot of patience, a lot of money." I saw a few of her friends nod in agreement, looking at me with a mix of pity and expectation. They expected me to look grateful. Margaret took a slow sip of her wine. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of deep, fake sorrow. "We gave him everything. A roof over his head, a job at our family lumber yard, a safe place to live. But lately, things have changed. Sometimes, no matter how much you give, it's just never enough. Sometimes, the people you save turn out to be deeply ungrateful." The atmosphere at the table instantly shifted. The polite smiles vanished. People started exchanging uncomfortable glances. They didn't know why she was suddenly airing dirty laundry in the middle of a crowded restaurant. My lawyer, sitting in the booth 2 tables away, slowly put down his fork. The journalist by the window subtly adjusted his digital recorder so the microphone was pointed directly at her. Margaret looked down at me. The fake sorrow was completely gone now. Her eyes were cold, hard, and utterly ruthless. She wanted to humiliate me. She wanted to push me out of her life right here, right now, and make sure the whole town thought I was the villain. She leaned forward slightly, raised her voice so every single person in the room could hear her, and dropped the bomb. "We only kept you because the state paid us," she said, her voice dripping with venom. The entire table went completely silent. You could hear a pin drop. The waitstaff froze in their tracks. The 40 guests staring at us looked absolutely horrified. Margaret stood there, her chin raised, looking proud of herself. She had finally said the quiet part out loud. She thought she had completely destroyed me. She expected me to break down, to yell, to jump up from the table and storm out of the restaurant in tears, leaving her to comfort her friends and explain how unstable I had become. But I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't storm out. Instead, I took a sip of my water, wiped my mouth with my napkin, and slowly stood up. I looked her dead in the eye, and for the first time in 28 years, I didn't feel an ounce of fear or submission toward her. I reached down to the floor, picked up my heavy leather messenger bag, and placed it right on top of the pristine white tablecloth. "You're absolutely right, Margaret," I said clearly, my voice completely steady. "You didn't keep me out of love. You kept me for the paycheck." Margaret frowned. She wasn't expecting me to agree with her. She wasn't expecting me to be this calm. I unbuckled the bag and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I opened it and took out the first stack of papers. It was the high-resolution photographs I had taken of the documents in a lumberyard safe. I dropped them right in the middle of the table, right next to her wine glass. "These are the state adoption subsidy records," I announced loudly, making sure the people sitting at the far end of the table could hear me. "The ones you kept hidden in the lumberyard safe. The ones that prove you received $11,200 every single year until I turned 18, just for keeping me in your house." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. A local business owner sitting across from me leaned in, his eyes wide as he looked at the highlighted numbers on the pages. Margaret's husband suddenly turned pale white. He tried to stand up, but I wasn't finished. I pulled out the next document. It was the contract and the invoices from the shady attorney they had hired almost 3 decades ago. I threw them onto the table on top of the subsidy records. "And this is the contract with your lawyer," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "The lawyer you hired to systematically threaten and manipulate 2 terrified teenagers into giving up their baby just so you could secure that monthly government check." "Ethan, stop this right now. You're making things up," Margaret hissed, her voice trembling. The confident, ruthless look on her face was rapidly crumbling into sheer panic. She looked around at her friends, realizing they were staring at the documents, not at her. I completely ignored her. I pulled out the third document. It was the commercial DNA test results. I slammed it down onto the table. "This is a certified DNA report," I said, pointing at the official seal on the paper. "It proves exactly who I am and where I come from. It proves that everything you told me about my past was a complete and utter lie." Finally, I reached into the folder one last time and pulled out a beautiful, framed photograph. It was a picture of the Navarro family, Lucas, Elena, Mateo, and Isabella, standing on their front porch in New Mexico. I placed it gently on the table, right on top of the pile of evidence. I looked at Margaret, whose hands were now physically shaking as she stared at the mountain of proof I had just dumped in front of 40 witnesses. I gave her a small, cold smile. "Funny thing about the truth, it tends to bring people together," I said. I didn't wait for her to respond. I turned my body slightly and pointed toward the back of the dimly lit restaurant. Every single person at the table followed my gaze. Sitting at the small corner table, Lucas Navarro pushed his chair back and stood up. Beside him, Elena, Mateo, and Isabella did the same. They stepped out of the shadows and began walking slowly and deliberately toward the center of the room. The restaurant was dead silent except for the sound of their footsteps. They walked right past the stunned waiters and stood directly behind my chair. My real father put a heavy, protective hand on my shoulder. He glared at Margaret with a look of pure, unadulterated anger. Margaret took a step back, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She didn't know what to say. The townspeople were whispering furiously now, putting the pieces together. But the trap wasn't fully sprung yet. From the booth 2 tables away, My lawyer stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, picked up his briefcase, and walked confidently over to our table. He didn't look like a party guest. He looked like an executioner. He stopped next to me, looked directly at Margaret and her husband, and spoke in a booming, authoritative voice that carried to every corner of the copper lantern. "Margaret Hale," he said clearly. "My name is Arthur Vance. I am legal counsel for Ethan Navarro. We have concrete, documented evidence that you and your legal representatives deliberately forged key information in his original adoption files." The whispers in the room instantly stopped. The silence was deafening. "We also have proof," my lawyer continued, making sure the journalist by the window was recording every single syllable, "that by falsifying those state records, you illegally secured and collected over $250,000 in state adoption subsidies over the course of 18 years. Margaret literally stumbled backward, bumping into a waiter station. Her husband buried his face in his hands. The 40 people they had invited to witness my humiliation were now staring at them in absolute disgust. The local politician who had been drinking their wine looked like he wanted to sprint out the front door. The journalist by the window was furiously scribbling notes on his pad, the red recording light on his device blinking steadily. The bomb had officially detonated, and there was absolutely nowhere for Margaret to hide. The silence inside the copper lantern after my lawyer finished speaking was so absolute you could hear the traffic out on the street. No one moved. No one spoke. The 40 people Margaret had invited to witness my public humiliation were completely paralyzed, staring at the woman they thought was a pillar of the Silver Creek community. Margaret finally broke the silence, but it wasn't with an apology. It was with a desperate, pathetic attempt at damage control. She stammered, looking at the local politician sitting 2 chairs down, and tried to laugh it off. She actually tried to say it was all a massive misunderstanding, a cruel prank I was playing because I was upset about my rent being raised. But nobody bought it. The physical evidence was sitting right there on the white tablecloth. The state adoption subsidy records, the lawyer's extortion contract, and a certified DNA test were impossible to argue with. The journalist sitting by the window didn't wait for her to finish her terrible excuses. He stood up, walked right over to our table, and held his digital voice recorder right in Margaret's face. He asked her, loudly and clearly, if she had any comment on the allegations of defrauding the state for $250,000. Margaret's eyes widened in sheer terror. She realized right then that she wasn't just losing an argument with her adopted son. She was looking at the destruction of her entire life. She grabbed her purse, pushed past a waiter, and practically ran out the front door of the restaurant, leaving her husband sitting there alone, pale and trembling. I didn't stay much longer. I gathered my documents, put them back into my leather bag, and turned to my real family. Lucas, Elena, Mateo, and Isabella were looking at me with so much pride and relief. We walked out of the copper lantern together, leaving Margaret's husband with a table full of shocked, disgusted guests and an incredibly expensive dinner bill. What happened over the next few weeks was a complete and total landslide. The local journalist didn't just write a small column. He published a massive, front-page expose in the county newspaper. He detailed the entire scheme, quoting the explosive audio he had recorded at the dinner. The story spread like wildfire. Everyone in town read about how Margaret had manipulated the system, paid off a dirty lawyer, and legally stolen a child from a vulnerable teenage couple just to cash a monthly government check. The fallout was instantaneous and brutal. Within weeks, the state officially opened a massive investigation into Margaret and her husband for adoption fraud and financial crimes. The authorities descended on the lumber yard and their home, seizing computers, filing cabinets, and the very safe where I had found the documents. Because of the undeniable paper trail my lawyer handed over, the state acted swiftly. Margaret was permanently stripped of her rights to care for children. She was legally barred from ever being a foster parent or participating in any state adoption programs for the rest of her life. Her sick, twisted business model was officially shut down forever. But the legal trouble was only the beginning of her punishment. Margaret cared about her reputation and her money more than anything else in the world, and she lost both almost overnight. The people of Silver Creek completely turned their backs on her. These were people she had gone to church with, people she had hosted at dinner parties, people she desperately wanted to impress. Now, they crossed the street when they saw her coming. No one would even speak to her at the local grocery store. The family lumber yard, the business I had broken my back working at for free for most of my life, took a fatal hit. Local contractors and construction companies read the newspaper article and were completely repulsed. They refused to be associated with people who trafficked a child for state money. Almost immediately, her business lost its major contracts. The delivery trucks stopped rolling out. The heavy machinery went quiet. They were bleeding money, facing massive legal fees, and their community had entirely exiled them. While Margaret's world burned to the ground, I was busy building mine. I didn't stick around to watch her suffer. I had already spent 28 years in that miserable house, and I wasn't going to give her another minute of my time. 2 days after the restaurant dinner, while Margaret and her husband were locked in their lawyer's office, trying to figure out how to stay out of prison, I packed everything I owned into the back of my truck. I left the keys to the house on the kitchen counter, walked out the front door, and never looked back. I left Silver Creek and moved permanently to Mesa Ridge. The drive south felt completely different this time. I wasn't an unwanted kid running away. I was a man driving toward his actual home. I rented a small, comfortable apartment just a few miles away from the Navarro household. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried on my chest my entire life was finally gone. I could breathe. I also completely changed my career path. I wanted nothing to do with lumber, construction, or anything that reminded me of Margaret's endless, unpaid labor. I wanted to do something that actually put some good into the world. I applied for and got a job working at a local animal rescue center. It was hard, physical work, but it was incredibly rewarding. I spent my days rehabilitating dogs and cats that had been abandoned or mistreated, helping them find families that actually wanted them. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was spending my time helping vulnerable creatures find real love and a safe home, which was exactly what Margaret had actively denied me. But the absolute best part of my new life was simply living near my real family. The Navarro house became my sanctuary. I spent almost every evening over there, sitting on the porch or eating dinner at their crowded table. I was finally experiencing everything that had been stolen from me. For the very first time in my life, I had a brother, Mateo, and I started going to the gym together, and he spent hours teaching me how to work on old truck engines in the driveway. For the first time, I had a sister. Isabella dragged me to her college art shows, forced me to listen to her favorite music, and constantly texted me terrible jokes while I was working at the rescue center. And most importantly, for the first time in 28 years, I had a real father. Lucas didn't just tell me he was proud of me. He showed it every single day. He would show up at the animal rescue just to bring me a hot lunch. He helped me move the heavy furniture into my new apartment, refusing to let me lift the couch by myself. He asked me about my day and actually cared about the answer. There were no hidden agendas, no expectations of free labor, and absolutely no state subsidies keeping us together. It was just pure, unconditional family. The nightmare of Silver Creek was fading fast, replaced by the loud, chaotic, and incredibly loving reality of Mesa Ridge. I had survived Margaret's twisted financial experiment, and now I was finally getting to live. But the most emotional moment of this entire journey hadn't even happened yet. That would come exactly 1 year later, on a day that used to bring me nothing but anxiety and fake smiles. The first few months living in Mesa Ridge felt like waking up from a 28-year-long coma. Every morning, I would open my eyes in my small, rented apartment and just stare at the ceiling, half expecting Margaret to start pounding on my door, demanding I get up and go load trucks at the lumberyard for free. But the knocking never came. The silence in my new apartment wasn't the cold, oppressive silence of my childhood. It was peaceful. I was finally free. Moving to Mesa Ridge and living close to my real family completely changed the trajectory of my life. I didn't have to look over my shoulder anymore. I didn't have to pretend to be a grateful, subservient asset to a woman who only saw me as a walking paycheck. For the first time, I was allowed to just be a person. I was allowed to figure out who Ethan Navarro actually was. My new job at the local animal rescue center became a massive part of my healing process. At first, I just took the job because I needed an income that had absolutely nothing to do with the construction or lumber industry. I wanted to use my hands for something good, but it quickly turned into a genuine passion. My daily routine involved waking up early, driving to the shelter, and spending 8 hours cleaning out concrete kennels, walking aggressive or terrified dogs, and helping the veterinary staff administer medications. It was physically exhausting work. By the time I clocked out, my boots were usually covered in mud and my arms were scratched up, but it was a completely different kind of exhaustion than what I felt at Margaret's lumberyard. This exhaustion felt earned. It felt meaningful. There was one dog in particular, a massive, scarred-up pit bull mix named Rusty, who had been bounced around from shelter to shelter because he was considered difficult and unadoptable. The staff warned me to be careful around him. But every time I looked at Rusty, sitting in the back of his cage, shaking and terrified of everyone who walked by, I didn't see a dangerous animal. I saw a creature that had been repeatedly discarded by a system that was supposed to protect him. I spent weeks just sitting outside his kennel door, tossing him treats, and talking to him in a low, calm voice until he finally let me pet his head. When Rusty finally got adopted by a loving couple 6 months later, I cried in the staff break room. I was helping these abandoned animals find families that actually wanted them, which was the exact opposite of what Margaret had done to me. But the most incredible part of my new life wasn't the job. It was the people. I was finally experiencing what it meant to have a real family, with a real brother, a real sister, and a real father. Mateo, my 22-year-old brother, became my shadow. He was a mechanic in training, and he made it his personal mission to teach me everything he knew about cars. We spent countless weekends standing in the driveway of our parents' house, covered in motor oil, arguing about sports, and laughing until our ribs ached. He didn't treat me like a stranger who had suddenly invaded his life. He treated me like his big brother. Whenever he had a problem with his girlfriend or needed advice about his career, he didn't go to his friends. He came straight to my apartment, grabbed a beer from my fridge, and talked to me for hours. Isabella, my 19-year-old sister, brought a completely different kind of chaotic energy into my life. She was an art student at a local community college, and she was fiercely protective of our newly reunited family. She would text me at 2 in the morning with random, terrible memes, force me to listen to her favorite obscure indie bands, and drag me to all of her student art exhibitions. I didn't know the first thing about painting or sculpture, but I stood there in those cramped gallery spaces, holding a tiny plastic cup of cheap wine, feeling incredibly proud to be her brother. And then there were my parents. The dynamic with Elena and Lucas was something I had to slowly get used to, simply because I had never experienced unconditional parental love before. Elena was determined to make up for 28 years of lost time. She remembered everything I casually mentioned. If I said I liked a certain type of cookie, 3 days later, a massive container of those exact cookies would miraculously appear on my kitchen counter. But the most emotional moments were the family dinners. Elena told me that for my entire life, she had set an empty plate at their dinner table on my birthday. Now, I was sitting in that chair every single Sunday evening. The plate was never empty anymore. We would all sit around the crowded wooden table, passing bowls of food, talking over each other, and laughing loudly. I would often catch Elena just staring at me from across the table, tears welling up in her eyes, before she would quickly wipe them away and offer me a second helping of dinner. Lucas, my real father, was the steady anchor I had always desperately needed. He was a retired firefighter, a man who had spent his life running into burning buildings to save people, and he approached our relationship with the same level of quiet, unshakable dedication. He didn't push me to talk about my trauma in Silver Creek unless I brought it up first. Instead, he showed his love through actions. When the heater in my apartment broke in the middle of winter, Lucas was there in 20 minutes with a toolbox, fixing it himself so I wouldn't have to freeze while waiting for the landlord. When I had a particularly rough day at the animal rescue, he would just show up with a couple of sandwiches and sit with me on the hood of my truck in silence. He never asked for a thank you. He never expected me to owe him anything. As the months rolled by, the ghost of Margaret Hale slowly faded from my mind. I occasionally heard updates from my lawyer. The state's investigation into her massive adoption fraud had officially concluded. She had been hit with crushing financial penalties. Her business was practically bankrupt, and she was entirely alienated from the town of Silver Creek. She had lost everything she valued. Hearing that news didn't bring me joy, but it brought me profound closure. That chapter of my life was permanently sealed shut. Suddenly, October was approaching again. My 29th birthday was just around the corner. For my entire life, I had absolutely hated my birthday. In Margaret's house, my birthday was just an annual reminder of how much of a burden I supposedly was. It was a day of forced gratitude, fake smiles, and subtle manipulations. The restaurant dinner for my 28th birthday had been the explosive climax of that nightmare. But this year was different. As the second week of October began, I didn't feel a knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach. I didn't dread the upcoming weekend. For the first time in 29 years, I was actually excited to celebrate getting older. The Navarro family had been secretly planning something for weeks. Mateo and Isabella kept abruptly changing the subject whenever I walked into the room, and Lucas had spent the last 3 days meticulously cleaning the backyard grill. They told me we were just going to have a simple, casual family barbecue at their house on Saturday afternoon to celebrate my 29th birthday. I had absolutely no idea that Lucas and Elena had been working on a massive surprise behind the scenes. I thought I had already received the greatest gift in the world by simply getting my family back. I didn't know they were about to hand me something that would permanently cement my place in their lives and completely rewrite the ending of my story. The morning of my 29th birthday started unlike any other birthday in my entire life. I woke up in my own bed in my own apartment in Mesa Ridge, and for the first time ever, I didn't feel a heavy pit of dread sitting in my stomach. There was no anxiety about having to put on a fake smile. There was no mental preparation for dealing with Margaret's passive-aggressive comments or her forced, theatrical displays of affection in front of her wealthy friends. It was just a quiet, peaceful Saturday morning. I made myself a cup of coffee, stood by the window looking out at my new neighborhood, and let out a long, deep breath. It had been exactly 1 year since that explosive dinner at the Copper Lantern. 1 year since I dropped a mountain of undeniable evidence on a white tablecloth and walked away from a family that had only ever viewed me as an $11,000 annual paycheck. A lot can change in 12 months. Margaret's empire had crumbled, her reputation in Silver Creek was completely destroyed, and she was permanently barred from ever fostering or adopting another child. But honestly, I rarely thought about her anymore. She belonged to a past life. My present life was here in Mesa Ridge, working at the Animal Rescue Center and spending my free time with the people who actually share my blood. Around noon, I grabbed my jacket and drove over to my parents' house for the family barbecue they had been secretly planning. When I pulled into the driveway, I immediately heard loud music bumping from the backyard and the distinct sound of my brother Mateo laughing. I walked through the side gate and was instantly hit with the incredible smell of grilled meat and spices. The backyard was a scene of pure, beautiful chaos. Mateo was standing over a massive charcoal grill, aggressively flipping burgers and arguing good-naturedly with our sister, Isabella, who was trying to take candid Polaroid photos of him while he cooked. My mother, Elena, was practically running back and forth from the kitchen to the patio table, carrying massive bowls of potato salad, grilled corn, and fresh fruit. She was in her element, buzzing with an energy that only comes from having all of her children under one roof. Lucas was sitting in a lawn chair, holding a cold beer, just watching his family with a quiet, contented smile. When he saw me walk through the gate, his face lit up. He stood up, walked over, and gave me one of those bone-crushing hugs that I had finally gotten used to over the last year. "Happy birthday, son," he said, patting me heavily on the back. Within seconds, Mateo abandoned the grill to come give me a high five, and Isabella shoved a camera in my face, blinding me with the flash before wrapping her arms around my neck. It was loud, it was messy, and it was absolutely perfect. There was no agenda here. No one was trying to impress any local politicians or business owners. We were just a family hanging out in a backyard on a Saturday afternoon. When all the food was finally ready, we gathered around the large wooden table on the patio. I took my seat, and I couldn't help but notice how perfectly natural it felt. For 28 years, my mother had set an empty place at her table for a son she didn't know how to find, a son who had been stolen from her by a corrupt lawyer and a greedy woman. But today, every single chair was filled. I was exactly where I was always supposed to be. We ate, we drank, and we told stories. Mateo told a hilarious, exaggerated story about a disaster at the mechanic shop where he worked, and Isabella passionately defended her latest abstract art project while we all gently teased her about it. I sat back and just listened to the rhythm of their voices. It still amazed me how easily I fit in with them. Even though we had spent nearly 3 decades apart, our shared mannerisms, our matching senses of humor, and the undeniable bond of blood bridged that massive gap almost effortlessly. As the sun started to set, casting a warm orange glow over the backyard, Elena suddenly stood up and practically sprinted into the kitchen. She came back out carrying a large, homemade chocolate cake with 29 candles burning brightly on top. The whole family started singing "Happy Birthday." It wasn't the polite, quiet singing you hear in an upscale restaurant. It was loud, slightly out of tune, and completely full of unconditional love. I closed my eyes, made a wish, even though I already had everything I could possibly want, and blew out the candles in one breath. They all cheered. After we ate massive slices of cake, it was time for presents. I had explicitly told them I didn't want anything. Just being here was the greatest gift I could ever ask for. But of course, they completely ignored me. Isabella handed me a beautifully framed charcoal sketch she had drawn of my rescue dog, Rusty, the pit bull I had helped rehabilitate at the shelter. It was incredibly detailed and thoughtful, and I told her it was going straight onto the wall in my living room. Mateo handed me a heavy, grease-stained cardboard box that contained a vintage, high-end socket wrench set he knew I'd been eyeing for months so I could help him work on trucks. I thanked them both, feeling completely overwhelmed by their generosity. But then Lucas stood up. He didn't have a large box or a colorfully wrapped package. He just reached into the front pocket of his jeans and pulled out a small, plain black velvet box. The backyard suddenly went very quiet. Mateo and Isabella exchanged a knowing look, and Elena reached out to grab Lucas's free hand, her eyes already welling up with tears. Lucas walked around the table and stood directly in front of me. He looked down at the small box in his hand for a moment, taking a deep breath, as if he was trying to collect his thoughts. Then, he looked up and met my eyes. His expression was incredibly serious, but his eyes were filled with a profound, overwhelming warmth. He handed me the box. I took it, my hands shaking slightly, and popped the lid open. Sitting inside, resting on the dark velvet cushion, was a brand new, shiny silver key on a simple leather keychain. I stared at it, a little confused at first. I looked up at my father, waiting for an explanation. "That's the front door key to this house," Lucas said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know you have your own apartment now, and you've built your own life. But I want you to know that this house is your absolute home. You never have to knock. You never have to ask permission to come over. You never have to wonder if there's room for you here." He reached out and placed his heavy, warm hand firmly on my shoulder, gripping it tightly. He looked me dead in the eye, making sure I understood the absolute gravity of his next words. "You were never a transaction to us. You were our son." The moment he said those words, the last remaining invisible wall inside of me completely collapsed. The 28 years of feeling like a burden, of feeling like a leased piece of property, of wondering what was so fundamentally wrong with me that my own adoptive mother had to be paid by the government just to keep me around, all of it washed away instantly. I wasn't an investment. I wasn't a paycheck. I was a son. I stood up from my chair and wrapped my arms around my father, pulling him into a tight, desperate hug. I buried my face in his shoulder and finally let myself cry. I didn't care that my brother and sister were watching. I didn't care about anything else in the world. Lucas held me just as tightly, his own tears soaking into the collar of my shirt. Soon, I felt Elena's arms wrap around us both, and then Mateo and Isabella joined in, turning it into a massive, chaotic, tear-filled family hug right there on the backyard patio. When we finally pulled apart, we were all wiping our eyes and laughing at the same time. I sat back down in my chair, clutching the cold metal key in my hand like it was the most valuable treasure on earth. Because to me it was. It was the absolute key to my real life. I took a moment to look around the wooden table. I looked at Mateo, who was grinning at me. I looked at Isabella, who was already snapping another Polaroid photo of the moment. I looked at Elena, who was staring at me with a heart full of 29 years of stored-up maternal love. And I looked at Lucas, the man who had never stopped searching for me. I took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill my lungs, and finally spoke the absolute, undeniable truth. For 28 years, I thought I was someone's investment. Turns out, I was someone's missing piece.